right, welcome back, you guys, to another episode of Freedom Papers. Oh my goodness, I'm not alone. I'm lonesome no longer. We have Connor Clegg back.
Hi, everybody.
I'm so excited. Thanks for coming.
I'm here to save you from your loneliness.
I know. Oh my gosh. Yesterday, the last episode, we filmed it yesterday, but it'll technically have been aired last week once this episode plays. Very nerdy, intense, and my brain literally hurt after. That's one of the ones where I was like, I wish Connor was here to just lighten the load of how much work my brain has to do for this episode. But you guys, welcome back. I hope you subscribe Apple and Spotify. It's where we have the audio version of the podcast. Give us a 5-star review and say this is the best podcast you ever did hear in your whole life.
Morgan, will you be pulling your podcast off of Spotify to protest Joe Rogan?
No, because here's my, actually, let's talk about that. Sure. My little take, I saw Alex Clark on Politics. She was like super disappointed in Spotify and Joe Rogan. They thought it was weak. What I took out of it is he was like, okay, you're saying you want me to have people on the other side come on my show or like give them a voice? Sure, because remember Dr. Sanjay Gupta when he went on Joe Rogan? It was so many viral clips that helped our side because when we have to sit someone down on the other side putting their
for
craziness
3 hours,
out and they have to be held accountable in a long-term format of a video. Oh my gosh. I think Joe Rogan was like, I think we're going to, hear out the other people. You're right. We should have people from the other side on. And then this is even better. Some people were like, it's so weak for Joe Rogan to put that statement in the beginning of his episodes. I think he also had a little coyness to his attitude when he was saying that. He was like, I'm totally fine with a message going before the show saying that what the mainstream media is saying is against an opposite of what the people on my show are saying. Yeah. Sure, make it clear that the establishment is saying one thing and then we're having experts on who say the other. You see what I mean?
No, it's really smart. Everything he does is very intentional. I love it.
That's why it was like it was not a sign of weakness at all. And I love Alex. I'm not saying that she's wrong, but some people, I think if you look into his true intentions, he's like, sure, I'm fine with having them explain themselves and their behavior to the American people on my show where tens of millions of people watch.
Literally more than any other cable news show. Yeah, come on.
So that's why I'm like, cool. I want more videos of like the Dr. Sanjay Guptas and the stuff of the world. Like Dr. Fauci on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Always
I would
too scared.
love
Too
it.
much of a coward.
Well, that's the thing. They're not going to go on.
Right.
They're not going to. It's been too embarrassing for everybody else that went on. So, hey, I'm excited to see the first person they bring on. But Connor, we're talking about 17 today.
Yes.
Welcome.
I was 17 once.
I also, Edge of 17. When I was in high school, I know we have a lot of like students that listen and stuff mostly. When I was in high school, I would pick a song for each year. So like Edge of 17 was when I was 17.
Right.
18, the one that's like, I'm 18 and I don't know what I want. That one about being like rebellious. Think of me listening to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As we just got done listening to the Temptations before this, right?
Well, the good news is there's a Charlie Daniels song that's, was it 25 or 26? Have you heard that one?
No.
I just turned 25, so I'm feeling like an old fart at this point. But when I see those TikTokers out there in the world, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so old. But Charlie Daniels has a song that's like, blah, 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 at 25, or was it 26? And it's about being like crazy in 26, 25. And I'm like, that's kind of me, right?
Yeah.
I'm kind of crazy.
We'll go with
and
that.
Fun and rebellious.
Something like that, right?
Oh my gosh. Look
anyway.
My book is just already falling apart. Welcome to Freedom Papers. But today we're going to do Federalist paper number 17. And oh my gosh, you guys, it's not one of my favorite papers because I think it's one of the worst takes by Hamilton in existence. There's a few bad ones, but it's one of my favorite papers to talk about. That's why I'm excited, Connor. Would you agree?
I would totally agree, and we were talking about this before the show. It's one of those rare times where Hamilton shows a level of kind of optimistic naivete that we don't see in many of his other papers, right? Because we always start out the show thinking, wow, they are just so wise. They're looking forward so much, and they know exactly what they're talking about. I mean, they really hit the nail on the head. Well, this one, I think that he was way too naive, and he was really trying to cede a lot of the ground to the anti-Federalists and like give them a little bit too much rope, and he totally lost the plot. Like he kind of jumped the shark here. So I'm excited to get into that. But
yeah,
I was
surprised.
Confusing.
Like I was rereading the sentences. I was stopping and trying to reflect on what is he trying to say something that I'm not getting here. Like I was Googling more than ever.
Yeah.
Because like maybe I'm just not getting it, I guess. But no, his takes are really off base here. And this is the point. A lot of people, when they talk about Freedom Papers, the show, they're like, are you anti-Federalist or Federalist? And I say, I go back and forth with different takes, but at the end, this was both sides coming together to collaborate because we wouldn't have the Bill of Rights without the anti-Federalists. But it's so interesting because on something like this, I'm like, yeah, the Federalists were really, really bad.
Yeah. He had a very conciliatory tone, I think.
Yeah. And so, like we've said with the last episode and with paper 15, these are a continuation of what started in 15, talking about the Articles of Confederation. Let me try and find that title. 15 was titled The Insufficiency of the Present Confederation to Preserve the Union. It's by Hamilton. The paper 16 was the same subject continued by Hamilton. And now, again, number 17, same subject continued by Hamilton. We're not going to read until we get to a little bit into the paper. I have a quote, and then we're just going to start going off, and this is going to be a strange episode because I'm already kind of pissy about it.
Great.
So Publius says, I confess I am at a loss to discover what temptation the persons entrusted with the administration of the general government could ever feel to divest the states of the authorities of that description. The regulation of the mere domestic police of a state appears to me to hold out slender allurements to ambition. Commerce, finance, negotiation, and war seem to comprehend all the objects which have charms for minds governed by that passion. The administration of private justice between the citizens of the same state, the supervision of agriculture, and of other concerns of a similar nature, and all those things, in short, which are proper to be provided for by local legislation, can never be desirable cares of a general jurisdiction. It is therefore improbable, Connor, that there should exist a disposition in the federal councils to usurp the powers with which they are connected, because the attempt to exercise those powers would be as troublesome as it would be nugatory. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Nugatory. I've never seen that before. And the possession of them for that reason would contribute nothing to the dignity, the importance, or to the splendor of the national government. Let's just stop there. What the heck are they saying, Connor?
They were basically saying, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I tend to be, they're basically saying that of course the federal government would never want to encroach on the rights that are guaranteed to the states, right? We only have four things that we want to do: commerce, finance, negotiation, and war. That's it, right? That didn't turn out to be true. I literally wrote in the margins of the book here, I was like, LOL, that's funny. I mean, living through what we're living through right now and looking at that, I'm like, what are you talking about? You're silly, Hamilton. But no, I mean, this is such a, he's so off track here. And he really wanted these people to believe that, we wouldn't touch it. Here, just join the union. We won't mess with you. We only want these four things we promise. Pinky promise, right? Uh-huh. And I don't know that he was, being backhanded. I think he was serious, right?
I think that's the point of me, doing so much research on this paper. I was like, maybe he's being coy and I'm not getting his tone correct, or maybe he's not trying to actually make the point I think he's making. He's really saying, oh, don't worry at all. There's no interest that the federal government would ever have. There's no passion for man in federal government to say, oh, yes, it will suit us to take over these powers that should be handled by local jurisdictions or states.
Right.
We don't want them. It doesn't serve us at all. There's no incentive for the federal government to take over control of these things. And I'm sorry, but how wrong was he?
No, he's incredibly wrong.
Now we have the FBI going after school board concerned parents.
Right.
And we have just an endless slew of things. We have a Department of Education at the federal level to begin with.
Yeah.
We have a federal income tax. All these random things where it's just what?
How did we get here?
And we have Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton of all people, saying, well, that's not even a problem to worry about because those are things that just make sense that they should be handled by the local and state governments of the world.
He said just the attempt to exercise those powers, like you're talking about education, taxation, et cetera, it would be as troublesome as it would be nugatory, which means of no value or importance. Worthless is a synonym for it.
Thank you for Googling that.
Yeah, of course. I did earlier, but I couldn't remember. And then I thought this was hilarious. To do so would contribute nothing to the dignity, to the importance, or to the splendor of the national government.
What was he thinking?
I think that, and this is a common theme that we have in all of Hamilton's writings, he's very romantic about the idea of the national government, right? And so just like with a romantic partner, you want to sometimes hope for the best, even if you ignore the worst. And maybe that's what he's doing here, right? He's saying, no, I mean, that's way below them. They would never do that. They would never cheat on me. They would never, go sell crack behind my back or whatever. I don't know. I've never dealt with that.
You never know. People just lie.
You never know. They do lie. That's exactly right. But I don't know, man.
But that's why we have separation of power, checks on power, and it's crazy for Hamilton to be so naive.
I completely agree. But, I mean, at the end of the day, he was, and they bought in. And it's actually really interesting. So I don't know if we can like just dive into it. Can we dive
Yeah,
into it?
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to dive into it. So
I think this is going to be a free-flowing episode because it's so chaotic.
I think so too. So this obviously went through and we ratified the Constitution, right, as it was written. And then whenever they were laying out the Constitution, they said that we're going to make Article 1 the powers that are delegated to the legislature, right? So then you get to Article 1, Section 8. And even though Hamilton says there's only these 4 things that we want to deal with, commerce, finance, negotiation, and war, you go to Article 1, Section 8, and I'm here in the same copy of Freedom Papers that Morgan uses. It's a beautiful book. Morgan got it for me last week. It was incredible. And it goes on for 1, 2, like 3 full pages that are explaining all the powers of Congress. And it goes way beyond commerce, finance, negotiation, and war. And it ends with like this real slap in the face. Have you ever read Article 1, Section 8, the last section of it, 179 through, what is this? Whatever. It says,
it out loud for
to
everybody.
make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. That's incredibly vague. What the hell is necessary and proper? Who decides what is necessary and proper?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that, jive with, well, we only want 4 things, commerce, finance, negotiation, and war. It doesn't.
Yeah. And then you're right, it's a slap in the face
It's
to
a
then
total
try
slap in
and
the face.
justify to the people, well, there's no dignity in us trying to gain power in anything else anyways. Don't worry.
Right.
It seems like you're like gaslighting mental abuse in a relationship where they're like, I was talking to some girls about it of like when a guy will like another girl's Instagram picture, and Instagram's a little, flashy these
Right,
days.
right.
People post some strange things.
Sure.
Not necessarily people like me because I'm a grandma.
That's right.
But people will post some weird things, and then guys will like it and then say, well, why are you even worried? They're my friend. Or
Yeah.
like, I'm just helping them and supporting them. Or I've made content with them before, and you shouldn't be jealous. I love you, all these things.
Yeah.
It just feels like that's how he's speaking to the readers.
Exactly.
Like, why are you even worried? It's not going to benefit the people, the politicians anyways, to try and take that power over you. When that's exactly what happened.
Right.
So that's why I was so thrown off by his tone, because I usually am like, oh, they're such great writers. And this time I'm like, what were they, like angry when they
Kinda
wrote
dumb,
this?
yeah, I
Or,
don't know.
like did
normally
they
you
just
can-
have a little too much to drink that night?
You can tell when Hamilton's being coy. Like some of his other papers, it was a few back. It might have been 14, or I don't really remember. So there's no point in guessing. But you could tell that he was being like kind of fun with it. Like he had exclamation points and he had like all these like italicized things, and it was like he had a little bit of an attitude about him, but he was right. He was empowered by his confidence because he was in the right here. This one, it's just like straightforward. It's just like, yeah, like I'm being dead serious. We only want 4 things, I promise. And it's just
Very
really,
off
really
base.
odd. And then in the time that we're living in today, obviously, like you said, we know that that's not true. I mean,
And that's what I want to talk about.
even something as simple as like the idea that we could have a mask, mandate or a vaccine mandate or anything like that on every citizen in the United States, which is in effect what's being done, right?
Mhm.
That flies so in the face of what we should be allowing our federal government to do. And then they're suing states who try to oppose them, or they're like sitting in the feds to, crack down on these states that are opposing national policy. Like how did we get here? Well, we got here because we let the federal government become way too powerful and way too expansive. And ultimately, it's going to lead to the end of, something that I call the Pax Americana, just like the Pax Romana, a peaceful America. We don't have that anymore, right? Because at the end of it, there's been so much tension created between state and local authority and the federal government that it's impossible to live a peaceful life without having to worry about the feds knocking down your door or calling you a domestic terrorist or surveilling you under the Patriot Act or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's bad news, folks.
Yeah, actually, and we'll get into that. Let's read the next section because I had some thoughts. He goes on to say, but let it be admitted, for argument's sake, that mere wantonness and lust of domination would be sufficient to beget that disposition. Still, it may be safely affirmed that the sense of the constituent body of the national representatives, or in other words, the people of several states, would control the indulgence of so extravagant an appetite. It will always be far more easy for the state governments to encroach upon the national authorities than for the national government to encroach upon the state authorities. What in God's name is he saying? Because it's the only thing saving us right now is the conservative governors in states that are
Right.
protecting us from federal tyranny. Like
Exactly.
Ron DeSantis out there. He's the only thing protecting the people of Florida from being oppressed by the federal government. And if you don't live in a state with a governor that will protect you,
Sorry.
you're doomed.
Yeah, you're totally doomed.
You're doomed to Fauciism.
Yeah, and that's like literally I wrote in my column again, it said, let it be admitted for argument's sake, as if this is something that would never happen, that mere wantonness and lust of domination would be sufficient to beget that disposition. Mere wantonness and lust of domination, I think, is Anthony Fauci's middle name. He can't fit it on a name tag, so it just says Anthony M. Fauci for mere. But yeah, tell me that doesn't describe like every left-leaning president that we've had in I don't know how many years, right? Tell me that doesn't describe the deep state bureaucrats like Fauci. Tell me that doesn't describe, J. Edgar Hoover or any of the, the spy chiefs and stuff. Because that's exactly what motivates them.
Well, Connor, that's what I'm so frustrated by is it's like they just forgot all the principles they've been teaching us in all the other papers. Because for so long we've been talking about how mankind, humankind, or human nature and mankind, it's just natural in our natural senses as animals that we will seek power. And when we have power, we will probably be corrupted. And so the whole point of making the Constitution was to provide these checks, to create a system that stopped people from being incentivized to oppress each other. And then we just completely disregard that now, saying, well, there's no desire. I mean, like maybe if somebody, I guess, was feeling selfish, they could do it. But it would definitely happen more likely from the states oppressing the federal government and stopping the federal government. What?
And that's another instance in there where he's waving with his left hand, but like shaking someone else's hand with his right behind his back, is that they put into the Constitution, whenever they ratified it, the Supremacy Clause, which says that no state shall make a law which, overrides or overrules something that the federal government does. So it's like, how could you possibly, on one hand, believe in something like the Supremacy Clause, while on the other hand, say in Federalist 17, that the states are more of a threat to the national government than vice versa? Like that it doesn't even track. It doesn't compute.
It just seems offensive.
It seems offensive.
I don't mean
to
be whatever it's called, whatever we call the lefties, snowflakes.
Assholes.
I'm not being a snowflake right now, but I am offended. Okay,
well,
now there's a million.
Disappointed is another word, right?
Thank you, Connor. But I just think he's being extra rude with how he speaks, and that's why I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of offended.
I'm over you, Hamilton. That's why we have
it's
a
like
Madison
you really
bust
want
and
me
not
to
a
start
Hamilton
identifying as anti-federalist, don't you?
Right.
There's so many issues where we can look for examples of how this is just not true. One of them that came to mind, because you and I, you're from Texas. I've lived in Texas. I have a house in Texas. It's just the border situation that's going on. The federal government, the federal politicians and federal bureaucrats are committing dereliction of duty. And the states are trying their damnedest to fight back and to create their own border wall, to do their own security at the border, to send the National Guard, whatever they could possibly do. Florida's even trying to help at the state level, help Texas, protect the Texas border at the southern border, when our federal government should be doing it. And it's the federal government that's then suing them, and then we have to sue back, and then there's this whole system of the courts where we're trying to fight it out. But why would the federal government step in something like this when it's so against the average American people? And it's a situation where the states are trying to do the work of the federal government, and the federal government is stopping them. It's the exact opposite of what Hamilton said. I can't imagine it being the other way around.
No, me neither. And the states already are like under-equipped to do the work of the federal government, obviously, just based on tax revenue and preparedness and, general military posture. Like one of the things that we should leave to the federal government is war, right? But the fact of the matter is that if you live in a southern state, we're under a invasion right now, right? 2 million illegal aliens flowed through our southern border last year, totally unchecked for all intents and purposes, right? And any time that there was an attempt to stop it, which many of those attempts came too late from the states, from Texas and from Arizona and all of these border states. New Mexico hasn't done anything. California hasn't done anything, obviously. They came way too late. But any time an attempt was made to stop it, there was this overly burdensome, pushback from the Biden regime, or the President Joe Biden's administration, I guess, for our purposes here. And what was actually kind of disappointing to me is that conservative governors, right-leaning leaders in these states, they really didn't have the chutzpah to take this head on immediately. I don't know if you remember this, but we were really frustrated about it on the Charlie Kirk show, when there was this coalition of governors, if they really want to call themselves that, they should be ashamed to sometimes, who thought they were doing something so big. They thought they were so cool. They went on Fox, or they went on a news station, and they said, well, we just got done penning a letter to the Biden administration telling him that he's not doing enough to secure the border, and we're demanding that he meet with us. And I'm like, what? Like a letter? That's how you're going to stop the border invasion? That's what you're going to do? Why don't you send the National Guard to the border? Why don't you deploy troops? Why don't you do what Ron DeSantis eventually did, Governor Ron DeSantis eventually did, and arrest these people for trespassing, right? Because you can do that. That's within your rights. No, they sent a letter. It wasn't until people like us spoke up, people in the grassroots spoke up, people like Charlie Show spoke up, people like Tucker Carlson spoke up and said, what the hell are you doing down there? Grow some intestinal fortitude and secure your dang border, right? Then they finally did it because they're like, oh, crap, we're getting embarrassed on national TV. So anyway, the moral of the story, the reason why I say that is it's this long-standing agreement that we've had between the states and the federal government that conservatives have gotten confused because we are the party of law and order. We don't want to go against what the Constitution says. We generally speaking don't, right? Yeah. So we've always said, well, it's a federal issue and we can't break the law. Well, the left does it all the time, so why don't you do it sometimes? A little bit, right? Just a little bit. Just dip your toe in the water of disobeying the Constitution and secure your damn state because it's for the moral good.
And that's what I wonder, if this is true dereliction of duty and that's the kind of verbiage we're hearing these days, then when is it right for the states to step up? Because if the federal government is not serving the basic needs of its citizens, its taxpayers,
which it's not,
then is it a violation of the Constitution for the state to step up and say, okay, then I'm going to do it? And it's just so convoluted, but it's really, I hope you guys understand, everybody listening, it is so strange to hear the way he speaks in this paper. It just totally threw me off. We could go through this episode and just talk about all the different times the federal government has caused problems. And I try to wonder, and I tried to reason. Sometimes you hear like Jen Psaki, for example. Did you see the recent video of her where she did some Skype Zoom interview, and she sounded like Hamilton in this paper, the way she was just so snooty.
Right.
And I'm not saying that because she's a woman. I'm saying she sounded just as snooty as the man, Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, people always accuse me of that. I'm a woman, so I feel like I can call another woman snooty.
Well,
sometimes.
I'm a man, and I think I can call a woman snooty too because
like
sometimes y'all are. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Like, no, I don't want to date you, AOC. I am a 25-year-old young, straight, single woman, and I think you're an idiot half the time. And then I'm not going to continue that one.
Okay.
So we're just going to stop. I'll be nice. So Jen Psaki is doing this interview, and she was like, for example, I have 4 screens on my room wall right now. There's MSNBC, CNN, CNBC, and then Fox. All the good ones, they're covering important issues. They're talking about what's going on in the courts and doing blah, blah, blah. But then Fox is talking about what? The dangers of soft on crime policies. What does that even mean? You know, like, and like, I don't know, because people keep getting killed and a police officer was just shot in New York City. And there's massive problems. So then she's going on, and I'm listening to this woman talk, and she's saying, well, and then you have states like Florida just completely disregarding the people's will and the federal government. And I'm like, maybe that's what Hamilton was talking about, of this idea that the people in D.C. think that they know what's best for a state, when in reality, Florida's the good guy, Florida's in the right, the federal government is in the wrong in this situation, and Florida is standing up. Maybe the tyrants are saying, you, the state, you are oppressing us, you are denying our authority, and you're hurting the people. You know how it's a language game.
Right.
And so maybe it's not the same as what Jen Psaki is saying about Florida and what Alexander Hamilton is saying about states oppressing and putting their power over the federal government. But I see this kind of wordplay going on where you accuse your enemy of what you are doing yourself. And that's what Jen Psaki is saying to us.
It's typical gaslighting. It's what Saul Alinsky wrote about in 13 Rules for Radicals about how to defeat your enemy totally, right? That book, by the way, was dedicated to Lucifer. If you open it up, it was dedicated to Lucifer, who is Satan.
I hope everybody needs to read that
13
book,
Rules for Radicals. It's incredible. You should all read it. It's
Very
what Hillary Clinton wrote her senior thesis on at Wellesley, by the way.
No, it's so also it trains community organizers. That was the concept. If you've heard AOC call herself a community organizer, it's because the radical left considers themselves, when they don't really have any other jobs other than like being a political personality and wanting to run for office in the future, while you're causing the chaos in your community and getting your name recognition, you call yourself a community organizer. Hillary Clinton considered herself an Alinskyite, which is a student of Saul Alinsky. Barack Obama called himself a community organizer.
That's
AOC
the book that
did
built
too.
Barack Obama.
When you read that book, it makes total sense. And one of the biggest lessons, I wonder what your favorite lesson is. One of the rules is to create a movement on the left that can get so infuriated about any issue.
Right.
If you pick an issue and say it's abortion, your people are going to care about that for maybe 2 to 3 years, and they're going to be super pro-choice, and they're going to advocate for it all the time, and they're going to be women's rights advocates and stuff. But after a few years, you start to lose momentum, and then your movement kind of dies out. You can't bring any more money in. You don't get as much media attention. You lose momentum. And so Saul Alinsky says, make a population in your movement of people that can get pissed about anything. So that's why the left has successfully created that movement. That's why one week they're saying that everybody that won't say the proper preferred pronouns of the trans people are transphobic, and that's the biggest problem. The next week they're saying we're going to die of climate change in 10 years. The next week we're talking about white supremacy, and then the next week we're worried about Joe Rogan on Spotify, and it feels like end of the world, doomsday every single time with this issue. It's because it keeps momentum in their movement. Connor, what's your favorite?
Every day that ends with a Y is Armageddon.
Exhausting to deal with.
So exhausting, and people get tired of it. And one of the rules, actually, that rule number 7, which is one I think that the left is ignoring right now, which is really interesting. It is a tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. So what are we seeing right now? We're seeing people who are on the left get really fed up with all this COVID stuff, and they're like, I'm sick and tired of wearing a mask. And so the regime in Washington, D.C., and then we'll get back to the Federalist Papers here in just one moment, I promise. The regime in Washington, D.C. is saying, crap, we're losing our grip on them. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? I can just imagine Biden and Kamala and all these people and Psaki and Ron Klain. And they're sitting there, vaccinate the 6-month-old. And you give a shot to a toddler. I'm like, how is that going to get people to buy in? And then Biden is like, no, we have to invade Russia. And Psaki's like, well, sir, it's the dead of winter. We probably shouldn't do that if history's in. No, we have to invade Russia. So anyway, so they're just like, they're diverting course again. And if the domestic war on COVID is being lost by the regime, then they're going to get us into a ground war with Russia in the dead of winter. And I got to tell you, if Napoleon, who is one of the world's greatest, for all of his faults, military minds, couldn't beat Russia in the dead of winter, then I don't think that Joe Biden could. I mean, reminder, this is the same guy who couldn't beat a bunch of goat herders in Afghanistan. I mean, we let a 20-year war end in 24 hours because we just said, oopsie daisies. Yeah. The goat herders are, excuse me, sorry, buddy.
We're going to need to bleep that one.
Sorry. Anyway, to go back to your original point before we fall too deep down any other rabbit hole, I think that what Psaki is so offended by in that moment that you talked about was that they truly believe that they have an 81 million vote mandate, right? They really think, and I'm not getting into the legitimacy of the election, that's not what the show's about, right? But they actually believe that they are the most popularly elected president in the history of the United States. Maybe it's the case. Who knows? So they're sitting here thinking, well, how dare anyone oppose us? We are exactly what the people want, right? Yeah. They're saying that the constitutional system worked. It worked the way that it was supposed to. And now we should have the ability to govern the way that we see fit because that's what the people decided in November. Well, in reality, we have a federalist system, right? And that's beautiful. And so any opposition to their regime is an affront to their power. And the way that they play it is it's an affront to the people of the United States. It's a threat. We talked about this before. It's a threat to democracy, right? That's why you see everything as a threat to democracy, because they actually feel like they were genuinely democratically elected by more people than ever before. So if you oppose them at all, you are an enemy of democracy. It's so sick and twisted and sinister and evil, and we say that all the time. But the point cannot be belabored enough. That our federalist system works because we can actually stand up for, our communities that we know best. Hamilton says it in here. He even says it in here, right? He says that the states and the localities and the councils and the towns are the most apt and fit to govern the people of those states and localities and councils and towns, right?
Yeah.
So that's what DeSantis is doing.
That's what I don't get about it too. It totally conflicts what he's saying. He's saying the states and the local governments are going to be the best to handle all the other problems, so the federal government's not going to want to step in anyways. Yeah. Not only does it not serve the people in the federal government in any selfish passions that they may have, but the localities and the states are better to do it anyways. So then what the heck?
Oh, and can I tell you, I think that was probably true, though, just so we're clear. That was probably, we do have to recognize, though, and just to give Hamilton a little bit of slack, right? Okay. We do have to recognize.
You're right. I'm being a little tough.
I know, but it's easy to be tough because we're living through something right now that's unprecedented, right? Yeah. And I'm so tired of saying that things are unprecedented because it's like, everything is unprecedented. Today is day 688 of 15 days to slow the spread. By the time this airs, we're going to be on day 700 something, right? It's insane. That's unprecedented. Anyway, sorry, I'm fired up again.
I know.
So this was probably true up until 1861. Are you okay? Do you
Sorry, my hands hurt.
Your hands hurt?
Keep going.
This was probably true up until 1861, that the federal government really didn't give a damn about states' rights. Up until the point where states decided that they wanted to start leaving the Union, right? And then they were like, oh, maybe we should care a little bit more. And that's then when you see Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. And that's when you see things like the 14th Amendment come into play after the war is over, and then the 13th, et cetera, 15th, 16th, whatever. And there is then an interesting argument to be made that I'm not necessarily saying that I subscribe to, or that the show subscribes to, or that Turning Point subscribes to, but that started this long slide into totalitarianism, where under the threat, and we're seeing this play out today too, obviously on a smaller scale, under the threat of domestic insurrection like we saw in the Civil War, the federal government is empowered to do whatever they like, whatever they want, right? And so if they can say, well, if you don't enact this policy on a national federal level, then it's going to lead to another civil war, right?
Yeah.
That, in some ways, was the justification for the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act is obviously generally a good thing, right?
Yeah.
But there is literature out there that says whenever we decided to pass the Civil Rights Act in the mid-1960s, it opened the floodgates for anything to become a federal issue, right? Because if you can legislate at every minute level, the decisions of individual businesses and individual families, all these things, right? If you can legislate that, then you can legislate anything. And it has to create this open and tolerant and accepting society for all kinds of reckless behavior. So that's how we end up with drag queen story hours. That's how we end up with transgenderism running rampant. That's how we end up with somehow the conservative governor saying that he's okay with 4-year-olds chopping their genitals off,
Who
right?
said that?
Governor Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas, who's one of the most unimpressive people I've ever seen in my life. Arkansas creates really bad governors. I don't know if you noticed that.
We should have him invited to Freedom Papers, and we'll ask him to explain his stances.
Well, he's a scumbag and a coward. He wouldn't do that. But anyway.
They're going to reply to our invite with that clip of you.
I hope that they do. He was
Morgan, for these reasons.
He was one of the ones who signed on to that really strong letter to President Biden. It was him and Governor Ducey, God love him.
Oh, geez.
So,
well,
anyway.
You know what, Connor? I think we could rant about this one for quite some time. I hope you guys understand how weird this paper is. So you've really got to read it for yourself to just understand and get Hamilton's tone in this and go, what the heck is he thinking? At the same time, I understand that you got to put yourself back in the situation of this paper is technically about Articles of Confederation
right.
and how it wasn't working. At the time, yes, it was a problem because the federal government was very weak. Hamilton was saying there really isn't anything bringing us together in some sort of federal government. You just have these powerful sovereign states that are their own little countries basically brought together in a league. And yes, they would technically overpower the federal government or league power that is currently in formation under the Articles of Confederation. And so that's why I get it. I see in that one tiny glimpse. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But that taking a short-term solution or something like that, or keeping your eyes focused on only one issue, very tunnel-visioned, that's never going to work out, and I think that's what's happening here.
Yeah.
That being said, Connor, the other big thing, I got that lesson from this paper and then another lesson, and I want to talk to you about it because it is like our bread and butter. I read it and I was like, oh boy, I hope Connor can join. Okay, Publius says, it is a known fact in human nature that its affections are commonly weak in proportion to the distance or diffusiveness of the object. Upon the same principle that a man is more attached to his family than to his neighborhood than to the community at large, the people of each state would be apt to feel a stronger bias towards their local governments than towards the government of the Union, unless the force of that principle should be destroyed by a much better administration of the latter. The strong propensity of the human heart would find powerful auxiliaries in the objects of state regulation. Now, here's what I took out of this, Connor. How far have we come from that concept? And I think our country is so much in disarray right now because we are building a collective mindset. Now, this is before communism came on the rise, people, but a century or so after, in the 1800s and then into the 1900s, with the rise of communism and this idea that the collective is more powerful and important and deserving of your love and attention and efforts than your children and your family unit and your community and yourself as an individual, That all rose up 100, 200 years after this was written, and it's totally transformed society. That is the biggest threat, or one of the biggest threats, to a society that you can experience. The creation of a collective mindset where then the small few elites at the top control the collective by saying, we'll be empowering you, by controlling everything for you and giving you everything. The idea of a collective mindset. That's why our conservative movement now is focusing so much on protecting and reestablishing a strong family unit. Individuals bettering themselves morally, spiritually, physically, because we got some problems there, and mentally, because stronger, better people will create stronger, better families that will lead to stronger communities and stronger states. We are advocating for that now because we've gotten so far away from this paragraph.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually very, very fascinating that, and I think it was intentional, I'll say this, I think it was actually really intentional for the leaders of the federal government at the very top to kind of delegitimize the local leaders and to diminish the importance of being involved at a local level, because it really wasn't until recently that we started to see people on the right start to say, hey, get involved with your local elections, get involved with your school boards. Everything, like all the way down to the most local of elections, matters really, really a lot more than voting for president, right? And that's kind of a new thing. And I'm young, and maybe it was something before, but I consider myself a general student of history, and I haven't seen something like that before. We're living through something that I like to call the rise of the citizen. We like to call it that on the show, right? And what that means is that we're seeing citizens rise up and get involved at the most local levels, because they're saying, we have very little power to immediately take back the White House right now, or to take back the things that are happening in D.C. against our will. But by God, we can take back our school boards, we can take back our local communities, we can take back our homeowners associations, because think about it. From the smallest thing like a homeowners association, they can tell you that you can't fly an American flag. Mm-hmm. What does that do? That leads to this, A, it's anti-American, obviously. B, it doesn't respect property rights, which is a big deal here, right? So with the destruction of property rights, that leads to this entire idea that none of the local stuff really matters, because it's like, well, we don't really, what do I have to be invested in? I live in a one-bedroom apartment or a studio or something, and I really don't care. I don't have a neighborhood. I have someone down the hall who like yells at me, you know? What's the point? So anyway, yeah, you're totally right. You're absolutely spot on. That conservatives have to start really getting involved in empowering the citizen and empowering them to be, yes, healthy, yes, happy, yes, patriotic, and gritty and tough and willing to actually fight for the things that matters, fight for the things that matter. And at the end of the day, we realize that that's not a seat in Congress. That's not what they decide to do in D.C. in the halls of, the Department of Labor, whatever the hell that is. It's what's happening in my kid's school. Yeah. And it's what's happening in my, not to sound mushy or gushy or anything like that. It's what's happening in the rumblings of my heart and my mind that make me say, well, yeah, I do give a damn about this country because it's beautiful and it matters and it's permanent and it's something worth fighting for. So that's why we're working on those things, the conservative movement is. We used to rail against this idea of collectivism, and as we should, right? But there is something to be said about a positive collective mindset that values things that are good and true and proper and permanent. Mm-hmm. And that's not what the collectivists of the left want. They want you to just value the totality of will of the federal system and what the few people on the top care about. And that's so far away from what we want.
Well, because something that's interesting, so I talk a lot about education reform and what we can do, because I think this idea of abandoning and not paying attention or not caring about local elections or local school boards, local meetings, our city councils, our state governments even, we have overlooked them for so long that it's just become the norm. And we see whoever's president as like, oh, they're our supreme leader.
Our savior.
And it matters who's in Congress and who's not and all this stuff. We don't even care about state and local anymore. We don't even know. We probably don't even show up for the election day or anything like that. Right. And so we need to get back into that mindset. Totally. I think we are. But when it comes to things like education, conservatives are now saying, and I say this a lot, it doesn't look like just changing curriculum in public schools. Yes, we have to do that, but we also have to make sure that it's easy and accessible to send your kid to a different option, a charter school, a private school, or homeschool.
School choice matters a
The
lot.
left is making it very hard to start a charter school, to maintain a charter school, to send your kid to homeschool, to start a homeschool, start a pod. They're making it as hard as possible with regulation and bureaucracy and all these things.
And just tell me if I'm wrong, but that doesn't sound like it's commerce, finance, negotiations, or war. One of the four things that Hamilton laid out, right?
God,
does it?
no. No.
Okay.
And so the approach to fixing something like education is multifaceted. Sure. But when we talk, I also bring up this idea. It's the conservative and American concept of this collective that we have. And I would say it's more so community focused.
Yeah, community is a
We care
beautiful word
about
for it.
the generational impacts that our actions today are going to have on the future of the country. We want to build tradition and culture and community, and those things matter. That's the collective that we should be caring about. The left says, no, we should have government provided everything because the collective as a whole is more important than everything. So I found it funny. Did you see the video of the liberal or leftist politician that did the video? And she's like, we need to start thinking of kids as controlled and owned by the community, not by parents.
No, that's terrifying.
Oh my God, it went viral because it sounds scary. Because when they consider kids
Was that one of those Tic Tacs?
owned by community, it was like maybe a campaign video or something. I don't really know.
Dear God.
But it was this video promoting her platform and her group's platform, saying we can't think of kids anymore just controlled by parents and owned by parents. They're owned by the community. So when they say that, that's scary because they think that they have a right to make decisions like who should vaccinate a 3-year-old child and that they can force that on us. But when we look at this, we say we don't have rights to your child. We shouldn't be making decisions for your child. But I care enough about you, Connor, that I want your family to flourish too. And I want your children to have great access to everything as well and opportunity. We care and we're compassionate and we care about the people in our community and our neighborhood. And that's why we have that community mindset versus the evil collectivist mindset of the radical left, which is about government taking over and forcing us to do things for the greater good of the collective.
Yeah, the greater good. The government doesn't care about the greater good of the collective. Obviously, they don't. Right? If they did, then they wouldn't have locked us in our homes. This is going to air in a few weeks, but there was a study that just came out today that said that lockdowns actually had, quite literally, this is a government study, government data, zero effect on mitigating the spread of COVID. Lockdowns, keeping people locked inside their homes. But what those lockdowns did have an effect on was depression, loneliness, suicide rates, education. There was something that came out today as well, and a teacher in Baltimore, and we've always known that the Baltimore public schools are really bad, right?
Yeah.
Teacher in Baltimore came out, and she did it anonymously, like she's a whistleblower, and she said that there are 77% of kids at Baltimore's largest high schools, or at Baltimore's largest high school, who are reading at a kindergarten level. 77% of kids in high school. It's not just that they're not reading at grade level, folks. It's that they're reading at the level of a kindergartner.
That's insane.
We have failed our kids. Why have we failed our kids? Because we've given up on this idea that they matter, that parents have just handed them over to the state and said, here, you take them.
Yeah.
Right? And the state has failed. And how could we ever sit back again and say, no, these kids are ours.
Yeah.
You're not touching them. You're not putting a shot in them. You're not going to teach them your woke, trans, queer, black theory curriculum. No, we're taking our kids to a better school, and you better let us or else. And we're going to teach them that America is good, that Christ is real, that the Constitution matters, and that family matters. Damn it.
That's why it's like, okay, so Hamilton says some crazy stuff in this paper,
Yeah.
but I loved this paragraph from him because it's so true at the time. It used to be an American concept to care about yourself as an individual, your children, your family unit, then your community, and then that surrounding greater community, which was your state. And then you consider the federal government's role in your life. And so I agree with him completely. The problem is we've just abandoned that principle.
Of course we have.
It's almost like he took for granted that would be a continued value in America.
And it would have been a continued value in America. An object in motion stays in motion, right? Mm-hmm. That's one of Newton's laws. It's a fact of nature. Well, there had to be something that stopped this construct of our nation from continuing on the path that it was, that the founders set it on. And it was government interference outside of commerce, finance, negotiation, and war. It was when the government decided they want to get involved in families in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it became easier to get a divorce. It became easier to rent a home than it was to buy a home. It became more profitable to be a family with a single mother as opposed to two parents, right? Mm-hmm. It became a lot easier to live a life of licentiousness and vice than it was to live a life of virtue and goodness. And a community that is not bound by common moral principles is going to fall apart. And we see that in our inner cities. We see that in Baltimore with these schools. We see it everywhere. There's a really good book that I want to recommend to everybody on the show, and it's not the Federalist Papers. It's actually called The Quest for Community by Robert Nisbet. It's an old book. It's from the 50s. And then there's kind of an updated play off of it. It's called Bowling Alone, and I can't remember the author, but I'll get it for you. And that one was published in the early 2000s. But it talks about how as we abandon community and as we abandon these like small organizations and like these kind of like this idea that knowing your neighbor matters and being involved with your school matters and like things like that, PTA, etc. As we abandon those things, America got less prosperous, it got less free, it got more depressing, and then suicide rates go up, and then like the more we get divorced, the dumber our kids are, and like all of these things. It's such an incredible read. It's incredibly depressing. But like sometimes you have to like get a little bit of a wake up call to be like, crap, we got to get back to that.
Well, I'm gonna get that book. Thank you.
You should. You totally should. It's incredible. Actually, you can borrow my copy if you want. It's like thoroughly. It looks like yours.
I actually love to collect. That's the thing. Like,
Yeah,
I
do
might
too.
borrow it just to read it quick, but I love collecting.
I do too.
Did I tell you how I got my Constitution stolen from me?
Did you really?
Remember? So if anybody listened to the last episode with Connor, I told you about my homeless problem.
Yeah.
So they get into the apartment complex, and this is another situation of like when we don't care about local rules, then we have our apartments broken into, and it turns out it was local ordinances or state ordinances in Arizona where fair housing laws, it makes it hard to hold homeless people accountable when they're breaking rules. So we have a situation where we're in a gated apartment complex, but the homeless people will wait for the gates to open when cars come in, they get in, and they try to find open apartments.
Fired up again.
And so they jiggle our keys and see if our doors are open, and that happened recently with Alex and I where they just walked right in our front door. It was very scary. But what they also do is steal all the packages at the front door. And so Alex knows this and she makes fun of me. My roommate actually makes me open my packages in front of her so that she can laugh at me. And like half the time it's like seeds or like microgreen pads or survival equipment and stuff, like a hatchet. And she's just like, what? And then like a Native American remedy for smallpox. Like
What?
Like, so that's why she makes me open them in front of her. Most recently, I'm really obsessed with getting hard copies of books because I think if you don't know something and you have to Google it to know it, then you don't know it.
That's correct.
You cannot rely on having the internet for you always. And so I have a ton of encyclopedias. I have an encyclopedia of country living, which is like everything you need to homestead. I have all these recipe books, and I have every classic book. I have a budget every week of how much I invest into buying things. So most recently, my expense of the week for building out my homestead library was hard covers of our founding documents, and I think I got Common Sense and Democracy in America. And so I do a little bit every week to slowly grow. Some MFer, somebody. So I get a picture from the delivery people every time it's delivered. So it's like, your package has been delivered, it's at your front door. And then of course I see the picture, I'm like, great, by the time I get home, it's been stolen. So it's just so frustrating. But imagine the people that like thought they were going to steal something really valuable, and instead it's
I hope they read it.
It's like a hardcover
read.
copy of the U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, Common Sense, and Democracy in America. And they probably opened it and said, "Oh man, this is
They'll probably
lousy."
use it as
When in
toilet
reality,
paper.
it's like a super expensive version, and it's the most valuable set of documents you could ever have.
Yeah.
And so to me, I was like, this is one of the most important purchases I've made so far. I need it on my homestead. They steal it. Of course, they have no care for how important those documents are. They probably threw them right out. And it just seemed like a perfect imagery and story of the problem we're in today, where they probably thought that was like the most invaluable
Well, you know what?
box of products.
They're the most unvaluable person in our society, and they can go screw themselves.
Thank you,
And
Connor.
of course, excuse me, sorry, that was probably not very compassionate of me, but I don't care. We got to get tough, and the time for compassion has passed.
Oh, well.
Excuse me.
But I hope that was a good episode for you guys. The two lessons there were, yes, Hamilton is super confusing and I think a little too naive with his idea that it's not going to be a very good incentive for federal power to encroach on the people and to take over control of things that they aren't given, the four main core topics. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. And second, his belief that because America cared about the individual, the family unit, and community first, they would not allow the federal government to get this much power. How the tides have turned.
How the tides have turned.
Tides have shifted? Tables have
Oh,
turned?
how the turntables.
Wasn't that an office?
I don't know. Can I give a really quick closing thought here?
Yes,
just because it literally just hit me looking down at my paper.
Hit us
on this paper, I have commerce, finance, negotiation, and war written down. The 4 things that he said he cared about that the federal government was supposed to care about. And I just want to go through them really quickly and pose the question: are they even doing that well? Because I think we know the answer here, right? But let's start at the bottom.
That's a good idea.
Let's start at the bottom. War. Well, we're about to go to war with Russia in the dead of winter, and like I said before, Napoleon tells you that's a bad idea, amongst other people. We couldn't even evacuate our troops or our citizens from Afghanistan without losing 13 soldiers. We let goat herders take over the country. We haven't won a war since 1945, right? So yeah, we're not even doing war very well. We're more worried about being woke than we are at winning wars. So that's not going well. That's an X, Hamilton. Negotiation. How about that? Well, we were good at it for 4 years, but then it seems like we stopped. I wonder why, because we're now weak. So negotiation, are we doing well there? No, not at all. We're not getting good trade deals anymore. Russia has a pipeline, but America doesn't. We're suffering at every turn, and our border is wide open. We can't even cut a deal with the southern or the Central American states to actually take care of the issue. So even though Kamala Harris is on it, I don't know.
Yeah.
Finance, we just hit $30 trillion in debt.
Ooh.
No, we're not doing well with that. And then commerce. Go to a grocery store. Tell me how the shelves are stocked. Tell me if we're doing well at commerce.
Connor Clegg.
Okay.
Coming in hard at the end.
So until we can do that, then I don't want to hear a damn thing about our kids' education or our lives or anything like that.
Let's abolish the Fed. And
Hell
by that,
yeah.
I mean everything in it. All right, you guys, thanks for watching Freedom Papers. Freedom Papers. We appreciate it. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Connor, for joining.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.